The song that we had been singing and learning for this month of September, I had picked this out before I even was going to go back to the Psalms. And I find this very fitting that the song we have been singing and learning all month fits right along with especially Psalm 18. Because Psalm 17, when we learned from that was David crying out to God for help. In Psalm 18, God answers that prayer along with the other prayers, because there's other psalms which are called lament of crying out to God that David had called out to God for help. And Psalm 18 is very fitting that it comes right after of this psalm that was for help, to where God answers and gives praise. And I think this song, the praise song, goes very well with that I will sing to the Lord the praise song, for the Lord heard my cry. He delivered me out of the miry clay and set my feet on a rock. I will praise you, Lord. I will praise you, Lord. I will praise you all my days. I will praise you, Lord. I will praise you, Lord. Please accept my song of praise. And then even the second verse of, bless the Lord, O my soul, sing a new song. Jesus tore the bars away. Yes, he conquered each foe with his mighty power and changed my night in a day. And then goes into the chorus of, I will praise you, Lord. I will praise you, Lord. I will praise you all my days. And that's what Psalm 18 is about. That God had answered his prayers. And David is praising the Lord and giving thanks. And David goes into specifically how God had helped him. And let's review for a few moments of that where David praises the Lord. That look at Psalm 18, 1 and 3. For the choir director, Psalm of David, the servant of the Lord, who spoke to the Lord the words of the song in the day that the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. And he said, I love you, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock and my fortress, my deliverer. My God, my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. I will call upon the Lord, who is worthy to be praised, and I am saved from my enemies. That David had called out to God, and God heard him, and God had answered him, delivered him. Remember from last week that it was, this title says exactly, delivered from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. David had a lot of enemies that sought his life, especially David, that Saul took his army with him on multiple occasions, and two of those occasions he came very close to finding David. But God had protected David. Remember that Saul went into the cave? David could have killed him. David could have done exactly what Saul had thought that David was out to do to him. And what others did to slander David and saying David was not loyal. But David, remember, he didn't do that. He cut off a piece of garment and then came out. And Saul that asked for forgiveness. And then later on as well, remember that Saul was sleeping, and David and one of his men took the javelin, or a spear we should say, and a jug of water, and then called out from a distance. And that's the last time that Saul had pursued David. But there's other times where it's described that David would be on one side of the mountain, and Saul would be on the other. And they would go around. And then there was a city that was there were several cities at times that were going to deliver David into the hands of Saul. But David escaped, where they wouldn't be able to do that. And by the time Saul got there, that David was gone. You think of Absalom, that usurped his father's throne and sought David's life. Multiple occasions the Philistines came when they heard that David was king now of all of Israel. They came on multiple occasions. God had fought for them. And there's other nations as well that came and fought against David. Large armies. But the Lord had protected and delivered them out of their hand. And David is praising. And this is unique that David says, I love you, Lord. O Lord, my strength. That he declares the Lord, I love you. And to call God his strength as well. And so David praises God. First, as we continue to view that God had rescued David from death. That we saw that he describes death as cords, torrents, waves, and such, as the counterpart in Samuel describes these waves, that he felt like he was being dragged to the grave, tied up. There was no escape, and God helped him. And now, he describes how God powerfully rescued David. And it's no wonder he describes God in this manner, because God is all-powerful. There is no match for God. There is no one like God. And there will never be anyone like God. Even the false gods are nowhere even described as God. They are described just like men. That weak, that they can be overthrown, but there's no one like our God. Look at verse 7 and 8 of Psalms 18. Look at the power of God. Then the earth shook and quaked, and the foundations of the mountains were trembling and were shaken because he was angry. Smoke went up out of his nostrils, and fire from his mouth devoured. Coals were kindled by it. And then 2 Samuel, which records as well, nearly identical, with some differences, of 8 and 9 in 2 Samuel 22. Then the earth shook and quaked. The foundations of heaven were trembling and were shaken because he was angry. Smoke went up out of his nostrils. Fire from his mouth devoured. Coals were kindled by it. David describes God of getting up off his throne and coming to rescue him and to deal with his enemies. God's presence is described as in multiple different ways. One is an earthquake because the heavens shook, or the foundations of the mountains shook. The heavens shook. They were trembled and they were shaken. Smoke coming out of his nostrils, fire from his mouth. I mean, describing like a volcano erupting. And this is happening because God is coming in his wrath. But remember that God's wrath is different than our anger. We get angry because we lose our patience or our temper, because somebody offended us or did something we didn't like. That people get angry for different reasons. But still, our anger the majority of the time is sinful anger. God's anger is never sinful. His wrath is determined and controlled because he is punishing sin and evildoers, not because he's had enough, he can no longer take it. That's not what his anger does. It's determined to punish sin and evildoers. And this description of God coming, accompanied by earthquake and fire and smoke, should remind you of when God appeared to Moses and Israel at Mount Sinai. It's not an accident that David is alluding to Mount Sinai, and he alludes to other events in Israel's history, because God, this is his God too. And he felt that God came in this powerful way to save him. Look at this, Exodus 19, 16 through 19. Because God is described as coming by an earthquake and fire and smoke. The only difference is that in 2 Samuel 22 and Psalms 18, he's coming in his wrath to punish sin. God appeared to Israel not at that time because he was angry with them, but he was making a covenant with them, that they would be his people. But yet that still was a terrifying experience, 4 of them. Because even in Exodus 19, and if you read, I would challenge you to read 20 later. Exodus 20 describes that also the people are terrified. But this is how God's described as coming down. So it came about on the 3rd day when it was morning, that there were thunder and lightning flashes, and a thick cloud upon the mount, and a very loud trumpet sound, so that all the people who were in the camp did what? Trembled. And Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was all in smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire. And its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked violently. When the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him with thunder. Even Moses was terrified, because that's what the author of Hebrews tells you. That's his reaction. Hebrews 12:21, and so terrible was the sight that Moses said, I am full of fear and trembling. What an awesome presence of God, that thunder and lightning, this thick cloud, an earthquake. Here's a description as well as like a volcano, that it was like furnace. Loud trumpets, this awesome and glorious, powerful God that the heavens and earth cannot contain. And then also Psalm 18, 9 through 10, describes further God's presence of coming to his help. He bowed the heavens also, and came down with thick darkness under his feet. He rode upon a cherub and flew, and he sped upon the wings of the wind. 2 Samuel 22, 10, 11 describes that as well. He bowed the heavens also, and came down with thick darkness under his feet. And he rode on a cherub and flew, and he appeared on the wings of the wind. God is described as coming on a cherub in the midst of a storm, like riding this cherub as if he's riding a horse or on a chariot. Cherubs or cherubims as well are described throughout the Scriptures. They're the ones that guarded the entrance to the Garden of Eden after Adam and Eve were kicked out and banished. They were above the mercy seat on the Ark of the Covenant. They were the ones that would face one another. Their wings would touch. These cherubim. They're most likely the 4 living creatures that are described in Revelation, because a similar description of the cherubims in Ezekiel, where they have 4 faces of a man, an ox, a lion, and an eagle. As you have this description. But all David is when David is mentioning these things, he's describing God riding to victory, defeating David's enemies, like a mighty king coming to battle in his chariot, coming down. This is also probably allusion to Baal, the Canaanite god, because this false god was known as the rider of the clouds. But David is not saying that, trying to compare them as if equals. No, God is the one that's a true God. Baal's a false god. He's just of the imagination. And he's not the one that is the rider of the cloud. It's God that is. God who is in control. God who comes in power. God who comes as a mighty king, who is victorious. I think of as well as even when the heavens are opened up in Revelation, and Christ comes on a white horse, and he defeats his enemies. He is the one that comes in victory, not man. Look with me at verses 11 and 14 further, that David brings in Israel's past history. He does this for a purpose. 11 through 14, he made darkness his hiding place, his canopy around him, darkness of waters, thick clouds of the skies. From the brightness before him passed his thick clouds, hailstones and coals of fire. The Lord also thundered in the heavens, and the Most High uttered his voice, hailstones and coals of fire. He sent out his arrows and scattered them, and lightning flashes abundance and routed them. And 2 Samuel 22, 12 through 15, he made darkness canopies around him, a mass of waters, thick clouds of the skies. From the brightness before him, coals of fire were kindled. The Lord thundered from heaven, and the Most High uttered his voice. And he sent out arrows and scattered them, lightning, and routed them. This dark storm clouds for a covering for God's glorious presence, another allusion to Mount Sinai, when God descended in this thick cloud. But this thunderstorm also is described as hailstone, lightning, or as well as on top of a description of volcano erupting, coals of fire, that God is just scattering the enemy. He sent out his arrows to strike them down. All of this is describing God's swift victory, swift judgment, that he comes to punish those who are seeking to harm David, his servant, whom God loves. In this poetic language, David alludes also not only to Mount Sinai, but also the days of conquest under Joshua and the judges as well. Joshua chapter 10, verse 11 is this victory where they march all night, Joshua and Israel. And they get there and defeat these kings. And this is in this chapter, it's when also Joshua prays that God would allow the sun to stand still until they defeat the enemies. But also God not only did that. Look at this. As they fled, in verse 11, this is describing the kings and them. As they fled from them before Israel while they were at the descent of Beth Horon, the Lord threw large stones from heaven on them as far as Azekah. And they died, and there were more who died from the hailstones than those whom the sons of Israel killed with the sword. That God, David is alluding to these things, not because he just had some time on his hands and decided, this sounds good to put into this Thanksgiving praise. No, it has to do with that. He feels that God, the same God who helped Moses and helped Joshua, the same God who appeared at Mount Sinai, and this glory and this awesome presence and power and might, this is how he feels that God had helped him. And that as well as that this is the same God, that this is his God who's never changed. Look at verse 15. David further brings in more of Israel's history where God's power has been displayed. Then the channels of water appeared, and the foundations of the world were laid bare at your rebuke, O Lord, at the blast of your breath, at the blast of the breath of your nostrils. And as well as 2 Samuel 22:16. Then the channels of the sea appeared. The foundations of the world were laid bare by the rebuke of the Lord at the blast of the breath of his nostrils. Does this sound familiar when water was parted and the ground underneath was seen? You should think about the Red Sea and as well as the Jordan River. At the Red Sea, Israel crossed over safely while Egyptian army were overthrown and drowned. At the Jordan, Israel crossed over to obtain God's promise that he had made to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob. Exodus 14, 21 through 22 is that description that most of us are familiar with. Many are familiar with the crossing of the Red Sea, where Israel was complaining that you just brought us out to die, Lord. It was over multiple times they would complain that were there not enough graves in Egypt that you had to bring us out to the wilderness to bury us? When they weren't trusting God. But yet God in his mercy did this. In Exodus 14, 21, 22, then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord swept the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land, so the waters were divided. The sons of Israel went through the midst of the sea on the dry land, and the waters were like a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. God's mighty power was displayed. Joshua 3:13, it shall come about when the soles of the feet of the priests who carry the ark of the Lord of all the earth, rest in the waters of the Jordan. The waters of the Jordan will be cut off, and the waters which are flowing down from above will stand in one heap. So here, why is this all important to David? Referring back to different events in Israel's history. From God bringing Israel out of Egypt and through the Red Sea and overthrowing the Egyptian army, to God appearing in this awesome presence at Mount Sinai, to God as well as of the crossing the Jordan River, and as well as God overthrowing these nations, of helping Joshua and then later the judges. Because even the judge Deborah, she sings a song to God that alludes back to Mount Sinai as well. That we're giving praise to God for his help in overthrowing the enemy. That those who oppressed Israel. Well, he does this because God who helped Moses, Joshua, and the judges is the same God who helped him. This God who is immutable, the God who never changes. Moses' God is David's God. Joshua's God is David's God. The God that helped the judges is David's God. And so he gives praise to God. That he refers back to these things because it relates to his own experience, that he felt that God helped him in these ways. And there are times where God had helped him in miraculous ways. That one of those ways is the Philistines, where God said, you need to wait till you hear the marching and the sound of the trees. And then you go out. Where God had confused them and overthrown them. And so God had done these wondrous things that, because God never changes. He is this mighty God. I like what Charles Spurgeon wrote. David had in his mind's eye the glorious manifestation of God in Egypt, at Sinai, and on different occasions to Joshua and the judges. And he considers that his own case exhibits the same glory of power and goodness, and that therefore he may accommodate the description of former displays of the divine majesty into his hymn of praise. David's God, Moses' God, Joshua's God is your God too, if you know Christ. If you are in Christ, meaning that you are saved, that you are born again, that you have humbled yourself, seen yourself as a lost sinner, who apart from Christ would have been condemned to hell, but saved in Jesus because of Christ. This same God helps you and has helped you. You could probably think of times when he has helped you in the past, and he will still help you. He is all-powerful, omnipresent. He cares. His love never changes. He is all-wise and all-knowing. And we can go on and on about who this God is. But this God never changes. And during trials and suffering, he is sovereign. He is in control. We're all familiar with Romans 8:28, that God causes all things to work together for good. And speaking of believers, he is the one that is in control. And that's why Joseph was able to say this in Genesis 50:20. As for you, when he spoke to his brothers, You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. When people do evil things, do evil to you, they mean it for evil. But God means that for good. And He causes all things to work together for good. He uses those things for our good so that we're more like Christ. To be more like Him. And to trust God and live holy, godly lives. And so we trust Him. This God never changes. His love never changes. He is not a fickle person whose love is based on performance. We are to live godly, holy lives. We are to glorify and honor Him. But His love is not based on how well you and I perform each and every day and throughout the week. His love is never based on that. His love never changes. He can't love you and I any more or less. He loves us. And He causes all things to work together for good. And then also, I had mentioned this a little bit ago, but Christ is returning. Christ is returning one day. And He, that in Revelation describes Him as coming as might and power, riding on a white horse, followed by the armies of heaven. That this Christ is returning. And so we need to tell others about Christ. We need to be ready ourselves that when He comes from His church. And we need to tell others about Christ. That is the only hope. That's the only hope that anyone has. The evil that you see being done, of the businesses burned down, people's lives are threatened, they need Christ. That's their only hope. It's easy to hate these things. And we hate evil. We hate evil being done. But we should love people to tell them about Christ. Because He is returning one day. He will come again. And so David praised God for rescuing him. But then he also tells about how God completely rescued him from his enemies. Look at verse 16. He sent from on high. He took me, He drew me out of many waters. Or verse 17 in 2 Samuel 22. He sent from on high, He took me, He drew me out of many waters. Rescued me. That the enemy is described as a flood, an overwhelming flood. God has described those who He's going to bring against Israel to punish them like an overwhelming flood. And we know that if you ever seen what a flood can do, it can be devastating. That I think of when my family and I went on a trip to Pennsylvania. I think it was 5 years ago. The Jonestown flood that happened over 100 years ago that wiped out many towns. Awful what it did, that people were unprepared. There have been warnings for years that dam would break. And people began, because it didn't happen, began to ignore that. And many lives were lost. And just wreaked havoc on these towns. And then even I remember I think it was back in the spring or early summer when there was a dam that broke in Michigan that flooded a town. The water can do great damage. And so he is feeling as if he's going to drown. If God didn't help him, he would have died. If God didn't help him, Saul, on one of those occasions, would have killed him. If God didn't help him, Absalom would have killed him. And would have rather took the wise advice that was to go out immediately and track down David. But because God had determined to overthrow Absalom, he followed the advice of waiting to gather a larger army. If God didn't help David when the Philistines and other armies attacked, he would have drowned in this flood. He would have died. And so he felt like that God had powerfully and completely protected him and rescued him. Verse 17, he delivered me from my strong enemy and from those who hated me. For they were what? Too mighty for me. 2 Samuel 22:18, he delivered me from my strong enemy, from those who hated me, for they were too strong for me. David's enemies were too strong for him. And he describes them as a mighty army, a strong enemy. They hate him. They're not seeking out for his good. They want to kill him. They want to destroy him. And they're too strong for him. But however, they were never too strong for God. No enemy is too strong for God. They were too strong for David, but they were not too strong for God. Because God is the only one who is omnipotent, all-powerful, who can come to David's aid and come to his rescue. And this is the same God who comes to our help as well. There's no trial, there's nothing that can happen ever in our lives that can overwhelm God's power. There is no one that is too strong. They'll be stronger than we are. They may have more power, whether that could be even political. The laws of this land and the things that are going on. But yet no one is over God. God is more powerful than anyone. And then as well as verse 18, they confronted me in the day of my calamity, but the Lord was my stay. Or they confronted me in the day of my calamity in 2 Samuel, verse 19 of 22, but the Lord is my support. It is God who was his support. It is God who was his help. A solid support. Because if God didn't help him, he was facing disaster. That it was not his army he was leaning upon. It was not his mighty men. It was not his wealth. It was not the fact that he was king that he was using for his support. It was God who was his help and support. Psalm 121, 1 through 3. I will lift up my eyes to the mountains. From where shall my help come? My help comes to the Lord who made heaven and earth. He will not allow your foot to slip. He who keeps you will not slumber. Our help comes from the Lord as well. The same God who helps David is the same God who helps us. And we should give him thanks and praise because he is worthy of glory and honor. Whether that's thanks and praise through songs, because that is the songs we sing should reflect God's character and reflect who he is. The songs we sing should give praise to him, should put the focus on him for what he's done. And then as well as the words from our lips, whether when we're speaking in prayer or talking to other people, give praise to God. And then verse 19 of Psalm 18, he brought me forth also into a broad place. He rescued me because he delighted in me. And then 2 Samuel 22:20, he also brought me forth into a broad place. He rescued me because he delighted in me. Broad place. Why does David say a broad place? Because David thought he was going to die. He thought his feet would slip at that if God didn't help him. He was in this narrow place where his enemies surrounded him, overwhelmed him, were going to kill him. But God took him out of that and put him in this broad or wide place, a place that could support him, where he's rescued, he is saved because he delighted in me. Because David loved God and he was walking with God. Not because David was perfect. If that was if that was a requirement for God to come and rescue us, no one would be rescued. No one would help because we're not perfect. None of us are. But David delighted in living for God and following God's ways. He didn't have an outward religion. He had an inward heart of faith that delighted in God and desired to walk with the Lord and walk in His ways. And that's the type as well that we ought to have, this heart that desires to walk with God, delights in His Word, delights in Him, delights in living for His glory and honor. To live for Him, only for Him. And this is who our God is. He has not changed. This is written about 2,900 years ago. The 3,000. And the events that David had alluded to happened some as far back as 600 years before him. And so we're talking about 3,500 years ago. But this God never changes. He never changes. He is always the same. And this is who our God is as well. And we are to thank Him and praise Him for His help. We call upon Him for His help. We ask Him for His help. We bring our correct requests before Him because He tells us to. But we also give Him praise. Because in everything, in prayer and supplication, we give thanks to God. We are to give Him thanks because He is our help, and we are to look to Him and only to Him. We're not to put our trust in man. We're not to put our trust in government for help. We're not to put our trust in our homes. We're not to put our trust in any possessions we may have or anything for our security. We put our trust in the Lord and we give Him thanks and praise that He is the one who is mighty. He is the one who is powerful. He is the one that is glorious. And this God helps us as well. That He is the same one who helps His people and delights in helping His people. And He's never too busy to do so. We can try to petition our congressmen for help, our president for help, but they're not able to help everyone. We can ask our friends for help, but they may be busy. Or they maybe say, you know what, I can't help you today, but I can help you another time. But God, He's not busy. He's not overwhelmed. He's not tired. He is this glorious and great, mighty God, worthy of glory and praise and honor and thanksgiving. And this is who our God is.